Before I formally begin the lecture, let me give you a little insight into structuralism and modernism, the two movements in art and literature that electrified poetic consciousness in the first half of the 20th century. Talking about the cultural ethos of the times, I'll also talk about the reception of these movements in three major Indian languages: Bangla, Telugu and Hindi. Modernism was a kind of earthquaking literature. London bridges falling down, falling down, falling down, not with a bang but with a whimper. All the bridges seemed to be collapsing under the dystopia and the disillusionment promoted by or let loose by the two world wars. All the major structures, all the major narratives collapsed. In music, harmony and melody were no longer the guiding principles. In painting, solid structures and solid shapes were taken over by tentative impressions. And in literature, linear narratives, omniscient narrators and regular dialogues were replaced with broken narratives, patchy characters, self-reflexive characters and discordant dialogues tampered with the stream of consciousness technique. In architecture too, the dooms, the roofs and the pillars in cement were replaced with geometrical shapes in plastic and glass. The whole idea of distinct genre also collapsed and the prose seemed to be flowing into poetry. Prose got more self-reflective and poetry borrowed tools from drama and fiction to revitalize its tired bones. And what did this result in? Expansion of the range. Now in poetry the divide between the real and the surreal, the cosmic and the commonplace, the objective and the subjective also collapsed. And Sri Sri has a very interesting poem recording the change in the range and the collapse of the borders. Teeny weeny pups, eeny meeny ships, sheeny shiny soaps, all the world silent and noisy is material for poetry. Cottage lamps, postage stamps, dreams and drones and shrimps rule the realm of art for sure. All art is grand, all art is pure. The whole notion of purity collapsed. Poetry, they said, could be like mathematics, both pure and applied. And the 9 rasas could flow into one another. All the layas, all the dhwanis, all the rhythms, all the rhymes could flow into one another. They made a cocktail of the different moods. I mean, in India, the notion of a rasa said that if every rasa pulls you, elevates you to the level of meditation. But the intelligent interface of the rasa theory and the dhwani theory with the Western modernism resulted in the realization of the fact that there is nothing like pure consciousness. And who determined this? The psychologists, the sociologists of the structuralist philosophy. Like they taught, basically I am simplifying these things for you. They said that the mind is divided into 3 layers. The whole idea of culture, family, self being multi-layered, inextricably multi-layered, took roots here. And the mind, they said, is divided, is like a multi-layered cake. And the first layer consists of the conscious, the second of the subconscious, and the third of the unconscious. And the language that reflects mind is also multi-layered and polyphonic. Now, what are the three layers of language that reflect identities in progress? Logic, rhetoric, and silence. Now, this element of silence being a luminous zone is something that the Indian linguist also has talked about. But they have talked it in a different way. The intelligent interface of Indian linguistic traditions with modernist traditions in the West resulted in the realization of the fact that disruption, dissonance, etc. could also lead to the music of life. They talked about the music of meaning. Chaos also can be musical. In the jazz, the whole idea of syncopation, asymmetry, and other things were replaced with something that was all inclusive. You could be responsive to all the sounds in the universe, and nothing, and I think this is kind of because of the deepening of the democracy, that everything became so all inclusive. Nothing was discarded. All the sounds were taken in the fold of literature. All the images were taken into the fold of literature. Nothing was discarded as untouchable. It became such a major departure. Now, with this porous boundaries, the whole idea of the porous boundaries, Kabir also comes to the mind. Had chale so manwa, behad chale so sadh, had behad dono tajay, taki makta agad. Those who walk within confines are men. Those who go beyond confines are saints. Those who cross the limit and the limitlessness both are the wise ones. But that was a different kind of a transcendence, the kind of stylistic transaction, the kind of stylistic multi-layeredness also became important when this interface between the East and the West happened. And in the background of the riots and partitions and the wars that happened, the Holocaust that happened, the exiles that happened, all the boundaries collapsed. And poetry also became very intertextual. What is the meaning of this intertextual? Flowing into one another. Now, Payar is a traditional Bangla chand, it's a meter. Now, poet like Jibananand Das entered into a dialogue with tradition. He recharged the battery of tradition, the way you recharge your own mobile. And it created many departures in the Payar chant so that it became all inclusive. And the movement of sense is captured in the movement of sound there. In translation, that this movement of sound could not be transferred, but the squirrel-like movement of thought has been very well taken care of. This you will notice towards the end of the lecture when I read it out to you or somebody else does it. So, the twilight zone behind every word, that was taken care of. The halo element, how they said, the whole notion said that the text also has a subconscious, and from the object position to the subject position, all the associations, half ideas keep playing a musical chair, like a band of starfish. Ideas travel from the subjective to the objective, and in this journey there are certain blocks also. These blocks were called aporia. Now, when you read modern poetry, you'll also have to deal with these aporias. You'll have to untangle them. These are the things that you'll have to bear in mind, and you'll also have to bear in mind that there is no spoon feeding or passive reading in modern Indian poetry. Modern poetry believes in participatory reading. You have to be the co-producer of text. We believe in the notion of dignity of labor, so you have to earn your meaning for yourself. You have to walk your way to the meaning. And how can you do that? By navigating deep into the subconscious of the text. There are certain techniques, but the intimate reading is the most important technique for emerging as a very efficient co-producer of the text. Towards the end, I'll also talk briefly about the role of translation in the reception of modernism and structuralism in Indian languages. Now, since the Second World War, the need of a forceful civilizational dialogue was felt. And what was the way to enter into a meaningful civilizational dialogue? Translation. To enhance the inner boundaries and also to inhale the music of otherness in our own being, we need to reach out to each other in translation. And the translators and the role of cultural activists was a major one. The modernism, structuralism, Marxism, and other isms also traveled to India only through translators. Not only Marx and other philosophers and psychologists like Freud, Adler, and Jung, but also major poets all the world over were translated into Indian languages. And of course, Indian languages, when I say Indian languages, I also mean English, which has always played the role of a sutradhar, of a mediator. It's like the host. It has been a very good host. So, Penguin, you remember, Penguin played a great role in homing in all the poetic translations. We had translations from all over the world: Italian, French, German, Russian, Arabic, Polish, German, all these poets writing in these languages came to India on the wings of Penguin. And then they were further translated into Indian languages by two kinds of people, the academics and the fellow poets. Now, academics translated it with a missionary zeal to internalize the tools of modernism and also to prescribe the text in various courses. Now, the fellow poets did it with the view to intertwine the Western with the Eastern homespun aesthetics and ethics. And in India, there has never been a gap between the aesthetics or the ethics, because harmony had always been the guiding principle, the idea of equipoise. But the equipoise was challenged, and still, they tried to restore some kind of a balance between excesses. The whole idea of samyak drishti, when you see the ideas of disruption being filtered into Indian languages, you also notice how attempts are being made to curb the excesses. And we'll talk about it when we come to the texts. Now let me come to poets. Jibananand Das is the poet I'll try to begin my lecture with. Now, Qazi Nazrul Islam had established a Kallol mandala in Bangla. Now, and all the poets who were fighting against the romantic mushiness in the post-Rabindra era assembled there. And they were the poets like Vishnu Dev, Buddha Dev, Basu and Chibananand Das, who thought that the narrative of freedom had failed. It was no longer a grand narrative. So, the rhetoric of the romantic kind of poetry did not hold water. I mean, it sounded very hollow. If you talk about disruption in Rabindranath's language, it will not, it will sound strange, because for a grand narrative you need a grand language. But when you are face to face with disruption and collapse, then you need a different kind of language where the cosmic and the commonplace will juxtapose with each other, and there would be no divide between the daily and there is nothing extraordinary, but there is still some kind of an attempt made to merge to fuse the two kinds of traits, the real and the surreal, the daily and the extraordinary, and the street-like presence and the cosmic reality. So, this kind of a juxtaposition, which is metaphysical in nature but also different in many ways, were staged in India. Now, dramas of reconnection, this is inbuilt in Jeevananand's poetry. After the division of Bengal, when people were thrown to two different directions, this happens not only with exiles and first generation migrants, but also with women. And all the poetry that women write, or the first generation migrants write, or the victims of partition write, are full of, vibrating with a sense of place. The sense of place is so very important for them, and the prime mover of that sense of place becomes the memory. So, here this role of memory becomes so very important, and parochialism, as we know, has always had a very, very important role to play. It is a universal phenomena, parochialism, the sense of place. Sheemash Heaney, in one of his memoirs, very passionately he writes about how Irish pageants run to churches, Catholic churches, on the pavements of which are sold the local newspaper of the Irish pageantry. Why do they care so much for the local news? He writes at one place, I will read it out to you. Lonely on Highgate Hills outside St. Joseph's Church, I rushed to buy my Dunlop Democrat, and reading it, I was back in my native field, meeting my people at the eye level. Who has died? Who has sold his farm? Who has married whom? So, this kind of a local, is merged into the global consciousness of breaking all the boundaries. Now, proper names, somehow stab the poet rooted in his land, in his, his moral geography. And, his eyes and ears are all tutored with the reverberations of the Bengali landscape. And it is in this kind of school of instinct that his poetry takes off from. Now, sense organs in Indian philosophy has always played a great role. It has been the gateway to the supernal consciousness, and that is why in Jeevananand's poetry also sensuous images, sensuous apprehension of the place plays a very major role. There are tactile images, there are visual images, and there are auditory images, and the images of smell, which are wonderful. I mean, we can draw a list. They absorb, fly away like the mosquito net, flying off like a white heron, brushing Swati's lap, flying beyond time and space to celebrate beauties in ancient cities. Now, flowers like akanda, dhuldhul trees, images like sparrows' eggs hardening under the cane creepers, the desire, thick juice descending to the blue anana's core, owl wings flapping on the roof watch, soft water smells, smells of cricket in the air, smoky rice smells in the dark, earth's Kankavati defiled. All these images, you can touch, they become the permanent citizens of your imagination. And the Western perception of nature has always been very different. When you compare his treatment, Jibananand's treatment of nature with Wordsworth, Hopkins's, even Seamus Heaney's treatment of nature, or with Rabindranath Tagore's, Agge or Nirala's treatment of nature, you could see how different he was, how rooted in his own, ethos he was. And he never watches nature, never looks at nature like an onlooker. And in Hopkins, nature, figures out as God's grandeur. Here it's not a socially mediated reality. It's not even a patch of God's grandeur, but just a splash of memory. And the history of partition is very subtly hinted at, never referred to. But poetry always has been a shy medium, it's been always shy of details. Things can only be hinted in a poetry because it's had such a small space to maneuver, but movement is created in that very small space through music, through the music of meaning, through images. Now poetry broke its alliance with music, but it joined hands with painting, and that's why all kinds of images flow in Jibananand's kind of poetry. And the Sankhya philosophy, the whole idea of nature being an interconnected net, interconnected web, where there is no distinction between the animate and the inanimate, there is no hierarchy between the human and the non-human, is very evident in his poetry when he talks that he will come to this Bengal. This is so very important. He also means to say that he talks about the 80 crores yonis or the 80 crores of species that Indian philosophy talks of. He said he'll come not as a human being, but also as a myna, as a dawn crow. So he observes, he snaps all the hierarchy between these non-animal and the animal perceptions. Now Sri Sri, what is important in the Marxist viewing of the Indian, Vastic viewing of the Indian poetry is that this also is very folkloric. When you read Auden and Spender and other Marxist poets in England, you will never see them rooted to their ethos. But in India, even Muktibodh, who believed in the questioning of structures in the Marxist scheme of things, even he operates through Brahma Rakshasa, for instance. And Sri Sri, he is intertextual in the very basic sense of the term. He doesn't talk of snapping the divide between the caste and the classes, but also between, say, the classical and the popular. So he draws from all kinds of things. The whole idea, like when we talk about the poem Koi Has Raha Hai, Koi Ro Raha Hai, the very title has been derived from a Hindi song very popular in Nautankis. Like the lines say, Koi Has Raha Hai, Koi Ro Raha Hai, Koi Jag Raha Hai, Koi So Raha Hai. This is one popular source that he borrows from, and then he also borrows from a Telugu song. And what does the limerick say? Lord Shiva dug 3 lakes, 2 of them never fill up, another never dries up. Then came 3 potters, one had no eyes, the other two no legs. These 3 made their pots, one had no rim, the other no body. 3 cheers for man. Now here this sounds like Kabir's Ulat Basi. Kabir Das ki ulti bani, barsai kambal, bhigaye pani. But it is not actually an Ulat Basi here, because he is basically being satirical He says it's a strange universe where it's a callously discordant universe where one person's unhappiness reduces the other person to laughter, and somebody else's laughter reduces him to tears. So, such a callously discordant universe is something that is being pooh-poohed. So, words like that, all kinds of things, like he refers to Harishchandra, he refers to Meru, he refers to Dhwanyalok, he refers to Rudraksha, Rag, Kamboj. In India, we are so rooted in the mythopoeic and the folkloric that something or the other is always following us. The way in the nursery rhyme, a lamb followed Mary to school. Mary had a little lamb, and whenever did Mary go, the lamb was sure to go. Now, similarly, all these reverberations and echoes for an Indian poets, are universal companions. They never let him alone, and that's why even the progressive poets among the modernists in India draw sustenance from the folkloric and the racial memories. Now, this is something very distinct about Indian poetry. Now, when we come to Muktibodh, we realize that his notion of a D-class society is also very different. Now, in Panchatantra, there is some reference to class enemies, to people who can never see eye to eye with each other. There are certain enemies who can never be friends, like goat and wolf, for instance. They can never be befriended. But class enemies, according to Muktibodh, are not such enemies, because it's possible to visualize a D-class person. So, this also is a distinct feature. But one thing I want you to realize, that Muktibodh uses the rhetoric of othering, the language of othering, to play it down. Like in Arun Kamal, we see something like this happening when he says, "Sara loha un logon ka apni keval dhar." All iron theirs, all resources theirs, but the sharp edge is ours. Now, this is the kind of divide that he also talks about. He says, I am holding a broom, as a scavenger he says, I am holding a broom, but to clean what? To clean the muck of the mind. Not only the, and it's also because of, as a scavenger, I am responsible not for cleaning the things that you have, your furniture and your dirty spots, but also the muck in the mind. And in this feminist stream of Hindi poetry also, you come across the image of a broom. Like in one of the poems, it says, मैं एक दरवाज़ा थी, मुझे जितना पीटा गया मैं उतना खुलती गई, अंदर आए आने वाले तो देखा, चल रहा है एक बृहद चक्र, चक्की रुकती है तो चरखा चलता है, चरखा रुकता है जो चलती है कैंची सुई, और अंत में सब पर चल जाती है झाड़ू, तारे बुहारती हुई पहाड़ वृक्ष पत्थर, सृष्टि के सब टूटे बिखरे कतरे जो एक टोकरी में जमा करती जाती है मन की दुछत्ती पर. Now here the broom in the feminist poetry and the broom in the Dalit poetry, they have some kind of they play like a Vaman, measuring the two worlds in one step. But in the and then Gorakh Pandey has a beautiful poem, चिड़िया क्यों जाल में क्यों फंसी, क्योंकि वो भूखी थी. This is the class perception of the Indian reality. But a Dalit poet called Sam Kuvar, I'll just get the name, he says चिड़िया जाल में फंसी क्योंकि वो चिड़िया थी. So here the identity politics also comes in. But it's a very important thing for you to know that the way in Indian feminism we have started visualizing the notion of a male feminist, Dalit poetry has not yet reconciled with the idea of a non-Dalit picturization of the Dalit situation. So, Muktibodh, for instance, would fall in the category of the Sahanubhuti, but it will not fall in the category of Swanubhuti, but one leads to the other. And whatever be the Dalit Angs, there would be a time when poets like the non-Dalit poets like Muktibodh also would be considered in the canon for Dalit writing. Now, the whole strength of Muktibodh lies in the dynamic questioning of structures on the one hand and of isolationism and all kind of isolationism and all kind of disruption on the other. The dynamic strength of Muktibodh lies in the questioning of structures at one end and fighting with isolation on the other. He says that the whole idea of a void is been created by the privileged few, and those who are retaliating, those who are giving it back, creating revenge tragedies of all kinds are not to be blamed. All the privileges were sucked in by the privileged, and that's why the void has been created. Now, this void has carnivorous teeth and it's almost like a Narsimha with some kind of with a pool of blood in his jaw. Now, all these references are again folkloric and mythopoeic, which is very rare for a progressive poet of the West. He says this violence is contagious, no doubt, it's like a disease, no doubt, but if it has to be disrupted, the initiative should come from the privileged and not from the Dalit and the destitute and the dispossessed. We are like the parents suffering from AIDS. We are both the victims and the culprits. Fine. But if some cure has to emerge, the initiative should be taken by the people who have always been on the top. Sara loha un logon ka apni keval dhar. Now, this was his response to the Gandhian notion of non-violent protest. Fantasy, Muktibodh called fantasy the daughter of experience. It's in a very important article called Tisra Kshan, he says fantasy is the daughter of experience that rules the father. Now, this is a very interesting image, and I have noticed that in the whole range of progressive poetry in India, the image of a dictatorial daughter, a very commanding daughter flourishes. Like in not only in Muktibodh, where the daughter, the scavenger, is thinking about Munia, but also in Nagarjun. There is in the poem called Gulabi Chudiyan, he talks about the little daughter who has hung small bangles on the steering of a truck driver father to remind him of her presence. And then in Trilochan, there is a girl called Champa who commands the poet. Champa kale achhar nahi cheenti, Kalkatta par bajar gire. So that kind of a commanding image, daughters, Mini in Kabuli wala. And then there is a very interesting poem by Faiz Ahmed Faiz, a very different kind of a poem where he says, "एक मुनीजा हमारी बेटी हैं, हम ही कब उनको प्यार करते हैं, सभी के सबके सब उनको प्यार करते हैं, कैसे सबको ना आए प्यार उस पर, है वही तो हमारी डिक्टेटर." Now, these progressive poets felt that they had neglected home, and these little daughters were they were in fact foregrounding feminism. Now, these were the ones who were dictating new kinds of paradigms to the new man. And here, when Muktibodh says that fantasy is the daughter, commanding daughter of experience, is a very lively image. And it says that fantasy also believes in crossing the borders, in going beyond the confines not only of the caste and class, but also of the time and space. The whole idea of transcending, breaking the barriers, going beyond has been so very well focused through this image. And on this note, we'll also try to highlight the fact that translation also is a way of structuring the emotion. The kind of role fantasy plays in regulating the felt thought, translation as the most intimate way of reading plays this very role. I can call it a midwifely preparation of delivering a text to a different kind of a context. You know, it needs certain preparations, and now we'll be reading out the poems in original for you to see for yourself what these midwifely preparations were when the texts were delivered to a different context, and how, if the departures you notice, you can also think for yourself why these departures were a must and why certain kinds of adjustments, the way a little girl when she goes to a new home has to make a little adjustment, the text also has to make a little adjustment to the new home. Now the question is it going to tell upon, is this kind of a domestication going to tell upon the image of independent woman, the independent identity? Now, when Muktibodh says it's the independent identity that's important. So, even if Faiz Ahmed calls it dictatorial, it's in a very different kind of a way. It's a very pleasant kind of a way. It's a kind of dhvanyarth. It's a tilted way of acknowledging the presence of a daughter, who is, dictating a new kind of paradigm to the practicing poets. Now, we'll read the translations and you will see for ourselves what happens when you enter this transit house called translation. मैं तुम लोगों से दूर हूँ, मैं तुम लोगों से इतनी दूर हूँ, तुम्हारी प्रेरणाओं से मेरी प्रेरणा इतनी भिन्न है कि जो तुम्हारे लिए विष है, मेरे लिए अन्न है। मेरी असंग स्थिति में चलता फिरता साथ है, अकेले में साहचर्य का हाथ है। उनका जो तुम्हारे द्वारा गर्हित है, किंतु वे मेरी व्याकुल आत्मा में बिंबित हैं, पुरस्कृत हैं, इसीलिए तुम्हारा मुझ पर सतत आघात है। दिस पॉलिटिक्स ऑफ अदरिंग। सबके सामने और अकेले में मेरे रक्त भरे महाकाव्यों के पन्ने उड़ते हैं, तुम्हारे हमारे इस सारे झमेले में। अगेन द फोकलोरिक। असफलता का धूल कचरा ओढ़े हूँ, इसलिए कि वह चक्करदार जीनों पर मिलती है, द स्पाइरल। छल छद्म धन के, किंतु मैं सीधी सादी पटरी पटरी दौड़ा हूँ जीवन की। फिर भी मैं अपनी सार्थकता में खिन्न हूँ, निज से अप्रसन्न हूँ, इसलिए कि जो है उससे बेहतर चाहिए। पूरी दुनिया साफ करने के लिए मेहतर चाहिए। वह मेहतर मैं हो नहीं सकता, पर रोज़ कोई भीतर चिल्लाता है कि काम बुरा नहीं, बशर्ते कि आदमी खरा हो। फिर भी मैं उस ओर अपने को ढो नहीं पाता। रेफ्रिजरेटरों, विटामिनों, रेडियोग्रामों के बाहर की गतियों की दुनिया में मेरी वह भूखी बच्ची मुनिया है शून्यों में। पेटों की आंतों में न्यूनों की पीड़ा है, छाती के कोशों में रहितों की व्रीड़ा है। शून्यों से घिरी हुई पीड़ा ही सत्य है, शेष सब अवास्तव, अयथार्थ, मिथ्या, भ्रम है। सत्य केवल एक, जो कि दुखों का क्रम है। मैं कनफटा हूँ, हेठा हूँ, शेवलेट डॉज के नीचे मैं लेटा हूँ, तुलिया लिबास में पुर्जे सुधारता हूँ, तुम्हारी आज्ञाएं ढोता हूँ।
So very far. I am so very far from you people. My fires are so very different from yours that what's poison for you is food for me. Multitudes walk with me in my isolation, in my loneliness, friendly hands of those you despise, but caught by my troubled soul and held precious there. And that's why you'd rain your blows on me in public and private. Leaves of our blood-stained epics fly in our fight. I covered myself with failure's trash, finding heaps on the spiral staircase of corruption and cash. And though I've gone straight, I'm still bitter in what I do, hate the poison. For whatever one has, one wants something better. To sweep the whole world clean, you need a scavenger, and I'm not him. And though someone inside me roars each day that no work is unclean if the man is true, the work's still grim. Beyond the world and its end products, refrigerators, vitamins, radiograms, there's my famished daughter. In her intestines, a gnawing nothing. In her lungs, the shame of those who have nothing. Only suffering imprisoned by the nothings is true. All else is unreal, untrue, a delusion, a deceit. The only truth is a sequence of grief. I am the split eared, the underground wretch, correcting disorders. Under your chevrolets and dodges I stretch, oil covered black, bowed by your orders. Translated from the Hindi by Vishnu Khare and Adil Jusawala.
আবার আসিব ফিরে জীবনানন্দ দাশ। আবার আসিব ফিরে ধানসিঁড়িটির তীরে এই বাংলায়। হয়তো মানুষ নয়, হয়তো বা শঙ্খচিল শালিকের বেশে, হয়তো ভোরের কাক হয়ে এই কার্তিকের নবান্নের দেশে কুয়াশার বুকে ভেসে একদিন আসিব এ কাঁঠাল ছায়ায়। হয়তো বা হাঁস হব, কিশোরীর ঘুঙুর রহিবে লাল পায়। সারা দিন কেটে যাবে কলমির গন্ধ ভরা জলে ভেসে ভেসে। আবার আসিব আমি বাংলার নদী মাঠ ক্ষেত ভালোবেসে, জলাঙ্গির ঢেউয়ে ভেজা বাংলার এ সবুজ করুণ ডাঙায়। হয়তো দেখিবে চেয়ে সুদর্শন উড়িতেছে সন্ধ্যার বাতাসে, হয়তো শুনিবে এক লক্ষ্মী প্যাঁচা ডাকিতেছে শিমুলের ডালে, হয়তো খইয়ের ধান ছড়াতেছে শিশু এক উঠানের ঘাসে, রূপসার ঘোলা জলে হয়তো কিশোর এক সাদা ছেঁড়া পালে ডিঙাবায়। রাঙা মেঘ সাঁতরায় অন্ধকারে আসিতেছে নীড়ে, দেখিবে ধবল বক, আমারেই পাবে তুমি ইহাদের ভিড়ে।
I shall return to this Bengal, translated by Sukanda Chaudhary. I shall return to this Bengal, to the Dhanshiri bank, perhaps not as a man, but myna or fishing kite, or dawn crow floating on the mist bosom to alight in the shade of this jackfruit tree in this autumn harvest land. Or maybe a duck, a young girl's, bells on my red feet, drifting on kalmi scented waters all the day. For love of Bengal's rivers, fields, crops, I'll come this way, to this sad green shore of Bengal, drenched by the Jalangi's waves. Perhaps you'll see a glassfly ride the evening breeze, or hear a barn owl call from the silk cotton tree. A little child toss rice grains on the courtyard grass, or a boy on the Rupsa's turgid stream steer a dinghy with torn white sail. White egrets swimming through red clouds to their home in the dark. You will find me among their crowd.